So I'm going to talk about the kinds of aid available to families who have kids going off to college. And the first thing I want to do is clarify verbiage. So when I sit down and I meet with families, very close to the beginning of the meeting, often a parent will mention, and by the way, we're not going to qualify for any financial aid. When parents talk about financial aid, they are almost always referring to need-based aid. However, when the colleges talk about financial aid, they are actually referring to need-based aid and merit-based aid. Both are considered financial aid from the school. And so I always want parents to kind of correct their thinking a little bit there, because there is money available for people who have kids going off to college. You just have to understand how it's structured. So need-based aid and merit-based aid, these are separate buckets of money in college land. And some colleges have both buckets, but some colleges only have one of these buckets. And so I'm going to kick this off by talking about need-based aid, and then we're going to dive into merit-based aid. There are two forms that your family might fill out to determine if you have need. Many of us are familiar with the first one. It's called the Fafsa, of course. There is a second form that some schools use called the CSS profile, and some schools actually use their own financial aid forms. The Fafsa and the CSS profile have always kicked out a number called the expected family contribution, or the EFC. However, Fafsa changes that were legislated in December 2020 and buried in the pandemic relief bill that came out in December of 2020 actually changed this verbiage. So starting this year, the output of the FAFSA will now be referred to as the Student Aid Index. So today, the Student Aid Index is roughly 47% of a family's adjusted gross income. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I did not expect to send half of my income off with my kids to college, right? That it is an eyeball-popping number for just about every family. So what contributes to that number? Well, today the formula includes parents' income and assets, the number of kids they have in college, and the children's assets and income. So my first tip, and I'm going to share 4 of these, understand your potential to be need-based. Don't make that presumption that you just won't be. And then be smart about where your money sits. And this is where you need to go back to capital strategies, right? And have a conversation with the team there if this opportunity exists. But let's talk about this a little bit, right? So I highly recommend people fill out a FAFSA forecast. When I meet with families, I can do a kind of back a napkin math for them to help them understand what the output of the FAFSA will be. So if you want to take advantage of that, please feel free to do so. Why does this matter? Here's why. Because children's assets are assessed at 20% in the formula, where parent assets are actually only assessed at 5.64%. So your money goes 4 times further if it sits in your name as the parent versus having it sit in your children's names. 529 plans for the purposes of FAFSA are considered a parent asset and assessed at that parent rate. And I often meet families where they're like, oh, we're getting penalized for saving for school. No, you're not. No, you're not. Because your money sitting in that 529 plan has been accruing interest all these years it's been sitting there, far outpacing the 5.64% that it's going to be assessed at in the FAFSA formula. UGMA and UTMA accounts are assessed at the children's rate, right? So if you happen to have these as part of your savings plan, and the point of this tool was to help your student pay for school, use those first, get them off the books, and then you can start to tap your other resources. There are 2 big mistakes that we see that people make when they fill out their FAFSA. The FAFSA was never intended to have retirement accounts on it, so don't put those on there. The other big asset that lots of families have is their home, right? So the equity that you've built up in your home also does not belong on the FAFSA. So no retirement accounts and not your home, which when you think about your assets, Those are the big places that most families have their assets. So a relatively small percentage of the FAFSA is being swayed by your assets. Remember, your income is the single largest factor. And most of us are not prepared to quit our jobs and become a pauper for the purposes of college. So I know you. I've done this presentation a million times. I will tell you, I know you're already analyzing, like, what could we do? Where could we move money? You can almost never wiggle your way into need-based aid. You're either going to be need-based or you will not. And if the answer is not, there are different things to think about, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those. First, I want to bring you up to date on some of the Fafsa changes that I mentioned. So as mentioned, the pandemic relief bill in December 2020 was passed by the federal government, the legislature. And in that bill were 157 pages of Fafsa changes. It was a 5,000-page bill, right? So this is a very small portion. As we go through these changes, you will see it is unlikely that people read them. So here's the deal. These changes are going to be phased in. Starting this fall, a few non-formula-based changes will start to take place. One of those is that the verbiage expected family contribution is going away, and in its place is the student aid index. There are a couple other changes that will be incorporated, but they are not significant. They certainly aren't formulaic, so they are not going to impact the output of the FAFSA for families. But starting a year from this fall, so the FAFSA is always done in the fall of a student's year, at least that's when you should be doing it. And it is the FAFSA for the following year. So when you fill it out in fall of 2022, you are filling out the 2023 FAFSA. So in the fall of 2023, which is the 2024 FAFSA, that FAFSA has some of the most significant formula changes that we have seen in 20 years. And I want to walk you through some of these. The first is huge. This is going to impact a ton of families. Think about all your families. Maybe this is you. It was certainly me. We had 6 years, I think it was, where we had 2 kids in college. Today, if you have multiple kids in college at the same time, you actually get to take your expected family contribution and divvy it out amongst your kids, right? So with one student in school, if I had an outcome of a FAFSA of $50,000, so my expected family contribution was $50,000. When I had 2 kids in college, each student had an expected family contribution of $25,000. What that means for a lot of families is families who don't qualify for need-based aid with 1 student in college actually do qualify for need-based aid often with 2 kids in college. Well, that discount, if you will, that splitting of the outcome of the FAFSA is going away in the 2024 FAFSA, which you will fill out in the fall of 2023. So no longer will you get to split that number between your students. There is no question this is going to make college harder to pay for families who have multiple kids in college at once. The divorce formula is also changing. So today, only 1 parent in a divorce scenario fills out the FAFSA, only 1. And the way you make that determination is based on where does the student live. So in the current day scenario, wherever the student lives 51% of the time is the parent that fills out the FAFSA. Starting in the fall of 2023, that 2024 FAFSA, it shifts from where does the student live to who financially supports the student more. So what does that mean? What does financial support mean? We don't know. It wasn't defined in the bill. So we are still waiting for definitions from the Department of Education. Today, if grandma and grandpa want to help pay for a college education for their grand student, it actually can negatively impact a student who is getting access to need-based aid, which obviously is not helpful. So interestingly, this is one of the few positive changes that got made on the FAFSA. Grandma and grandpa, aunties, uncles, godparents, anybody who wants to help a student pay for college can do so and will no longer negatively impact the student. And those contributions can actually start this year. So for people who have students in college this year, grandma and grandpa can start to make those contributions and it will not negatively impact a student. And then lastly, small business owners today, if you have a small business and you're a small business owner, if you have fewer than 100 employees, you do not need to include your assets as part of the FAFSA. However, the definition around small business is disappearing. And so going forward, all small business owners will actually have to include assets on the FAFSA. Here's a fun little thing though. We don't actually know what assets they want because they didn't define that either. So there are a whole bunch of holes in this new FAFSA bill that have to be defined by somebody. My gut is it's not going to be re-legislated. If you're paying attention at all, you know that Washington does not really work today very well. I'm not hopeful that they will re-legislate any of this stuff. However, between the Department of Education and the colleges themselves, I'm super hopeful they fix some of it. We will see. What they will not be able to fix are the actual changes themselves, but defining some of those changes, and in the case of that no discount for number of kids in college, I think the colleges are going to have to figure that out. All right, so let's talk about merit aid, because again, if you're not going to be need-based, you're not. If you have a family income, the adjusted gross income of more than $280,000, you are not going to qualify for any significant need-based aid. If you're under that, there are schools around the country where you might, but at the end of the day, the question is always the same. The question is not, do we qualify for need-based aid? But rather, after need-based aid has been applied, can we still afford the college? Is it getting us to a point that we are comfortable paying for school? And if the answer to that question is no, then you need to look at schools that bring merit aid to the table. Merit aid is not based on income and assets. Merit aid are scholarships that colleges bring to the table for all things amazing and wonderful about your students. It doesn't have anything to do with kind of the formula and the numbers and all of that, right? So you have a lot more flux here in terms of how to think about high school course selection, the activities that your student is doing. All of those things play into the role of merit aid. Now, here's where you have to put your business hats on though. Because at the end of the day, if a school gives away money, there is a purpose to that money. And at the end of the day, what they're really paying for are the students they want on their campus. And it's not all about grades. I got news for you. It's not enough to just be smart in most of these cases. So I'm going to bring to you a little piece, if you will, of the behind the scenes stuff that is going on so that you can better understand how to do a more strategic college search. So Cece mentioned that I do free consultations. I do these every day of the week. I love these. I got into this because I care about this process. It makes me crazy that the colleges lack transparency. And so happy to sit down with you and chat through your own personal college search. These are great tips. They don't fit every single family. And so I'd love to deep dive with you. What are we going to do in our hour together? Well, I'm going to answer your questions around college search. We can talk about those goal areas, academic, social, financial, and then I'll suggest some strategies. I will leave you with some ways to start to think about it. I can give you a rough of the outcome of your FAFSA, that EFC or now Student Aid Index, and suggest strategies then. What pathway should you be looking at? Should you be looking at a mix of schools that bring both need and merit to the table? Or are you indeed the family that is not going to qualify for need-based aid? So let's really focus on merit and how to think about that.